When I was a child growing up in India and listening to the great epics Mahabharat and Ramayana, usually sung in verse by my mother, there were two phrases that I heard frequently. The first was, "The world is as we are," and the second was, "What we see, we become." So let me repeat those two phrases. The world is as we are, and what we see, we become. I did not fully grasp the profundity of these two phrases in terms of the deeper understanding of consciousness until much later. So when I came to the United States, 1970, what's that, 54 years ago, fresh out of medical school in New Jersey, one day I was feeling quite homesick. And so somebody suggested I go to Queens and have a Sunday brunch in one of the restaurants there, Queens, New York. So I took the subway and suddenly found myself in Little India and started to realize that this Little India was a projection of Indians who wanted to recreate India out of nostalgia. And they did. So in Little India, there was Indian food, there were Indian fashions, there was Indian music, Indian colors, Indian saris. Everything was very reminiscent of India, and some people even had parrots as cages as their pets, and you couldn't tell that this was not a street or a bazaar in New Delhi or Old Delhi for that matter. The world is as we are. The conditioning of the Indian mind created a matrix of collective Indian minds that projected the Indian world. And of course, in the United States, you have Chinatown and Koreatown and so on. This is what it means. The world is as we are. Our conditioned mind projects as the world we find ourselves in. And then what about the reverse? What we see, we become. What we see, we become. I first started to actually get the gist of this when I saw an Indian boy adopted by an Italian American family in Boston. And the boy was actually adopted from an orphanage in India. Before that, picked up as a little baby in a gutter, in a slum, abandoned. But this boy, as a little boy, had an American accent with a little Italian twinge flavor to it. And the mannerisms were Italian. And so was the accent with an American tinge, because the family that had adopted him was Italian American. But the movements, the gestures, the eye movements, the facial expressions, the tone of voice, everything reflected something not Indian at all, except the Indian features, not the Indian look, the Indian archetype, the color and so on, but not the Indian look. And of course, in India, if you go to India, you'll see there are 18 languages, hundreds of dialects, and you can tell which part of the country a person comes from just by looking at them and how they shake their head and how they move their eyes and how they gesture and how they say this when they mean yes, and all kinds of different behaviors, you can identify where a person is from, because they all reflect what they've seen. Okay, so what we see, we become. The archetype may take, a few generations to change. The archetypal look, or may take lots of generations. But the accent, the mannerisms, the facial expressions, the eye movements, the tone of voice become what we see, both individually and collectively, what the conditioned mind sees. Now, what has this to do with consciousness? Well, consciousness is not the mind. Consciousness is infinite possibilities, so therefore the potential for infinite minds. And the mind is a conditioned expression of consciousness. And it is conditioned by what we see. So we become that, and then it projects itself as the movement of that conditioned mind. And collectively, it projects itself as the world of that conditioned matrix of those conditioned collective minds. We both become what we see, and then the world reflects what we are as the conditioned self. But beyond this matrix of conditioned minds is the infinite awareness. Can't even call it a mind, because it exists as possibilities that can morph itself into any conditioned mind just by exposure. A child is exposed to a language, 3 languages, it learns 3 languages, because consciousness can take on anything it desires through this process that I call attention and intention. Consciousness manifests through attention and intention as a process that's called the conditioned mind, the conditioned body, and the conditioned world that is projected. By itself, consciousness is independent of all these projections and all these rules that are projecting these worlds. Consciousness is independent, eternally and now, as the background of these projections, but also as the programmer of these projections, the choreographer, the director, the producer, all the heroes and villains, the whole production in all these ecosystems of projected minds. When taken to an extreme, these provisional identities create conflict in the name of nationalism, in the name of religion, in the name of culture, in the name of the so-called economics of that conditioned identity. And that conflict can be very violent, as we're seeing now across the world, and can exponentially become so violent that it can lead to a conflagration or war or a genocide and murder on mass scales. And what are we murdering is our own self, conditioned in a different way. Our own self wearing a different uniform. Uniform means the body, mind, and the world that is projected by that body, mind. We confuse symbols for reality, and then the conflict is between symbols. There's no difference between these symbols and Greenwich Mean Time or latitude, longitude. They're convenient for navigating experience, but they also actually bind us. And this is the bigger meaning of karma, the bigger meaning of even collective karma. Recycling violence, recycling murder, recycling genocide since the beginning of our conditioning. Is there a solution? The solution is to be in loving awareness. I shouldn't even say loving awareness. Awareness without conditioning is loving. Awareness without conditioning sees its projections as itself, and awareness without conditioning spontaneously experiences empathy, compassion, joy, equanimity, and fearlessness. This loving awareness takes the courage to question our conditioned mind and go beyond that to the blissful body, and hopefully one day create a critical mass of this bliss consciousness, or just call it loving awareness, that can project itself as a more peaceful, just, sustainable, healthier, and joyful world. Okay, thank you for listening. And if you don't agree, then you don't agree. That's a different kind of conditioning.